Get the idea of price rigidity and frictions out there on the table, and then you can think about it and chew on it, and then you can spit it out and go for something better. Okay, so welcome to the 14th lecture. We're in the home stretch now. This is really where it gets interesting for a lot of people because it's what the modern state of the art is. If you go to a central bank now or to a ministry to use these methods, this is the kind of implementation you'll be dealing with. What I'd like to do is take the next 3 lectures to motivate that. First in broad brush strokes, and then next time we'll get into a bit more technical derivation of what we're doing. So let's just jump into it. Please understand that there are two sort of major approaches to doing macroeconomic analysis, dynamically speaking. One is without a reliance on the monetary financial sphere, and one that does. And the first part of this lecture today will be basically trying to motivate why we feel that the previous approach that we described and derived last time is just inadequate to reach this, to attain this goal. Okay, so last time we did a lot of technical stuff. This is really important. It's the bread and butter of what we do in macro, dynamic macro, because macro is about dynamics. I'm going to motivate that again, and then we're going to talk about why this notion of monetary neutrality, so there's a mistake on the slide, why might monetary neutrality fail? And I'm going to try to present some evidence from the data why prices and wages are not perfectly flexible. One of the prerequisites for the monetary neutrality proposition to hold, ignore the fact that we quote wages and prices in the monetary unit. And I'm going to show you some evidence that seems to suggest that at least at the micro level, prices are not flexible. For whatever reasons, they don't move with every jump of aggregate demand. There are lots of reasons for that. The last 50 years has engaged this question, and there's still new ideas and answers coming. So we'll stick to it at a very basic level and try to motivate your interest in maybe taking another course in this area, okay? Then we're going to think about how we can model this. So how can we actually model the fact that firms set prices, A. B, these prices are not set in stone, but they're not changing every day, okay? That's part of the data. And maybe think about the determinants, C, the determinants of those degrees of stickiness. Okay, so the most important thing we're going to think about is thinking of the firm no longer as a perfectly competitive sort of ghost that just does its job and no one cares, it does the job of the household. It's actually something that's doing something on its own. So in the modern Keynesian view, the firm actually sets prices. So we have imperfect competition. That's an inherent characteristic of the new Keynesian approach, is that there is imperfect competition. Firms face a downward sloping demand curve for the product that they're selling, and they are cognizant of that, and they actually set prices with a view to maximizing their profits, even though they're maximizing profits for the households. So we have a divergence from the first welfare theorem requirement. We don't have perfect competition anymore. We have market power. We'll have a distortion. We'll have a wedge between marginal costs and price. And this is an important notion in itself. So that means we're really moving away from the first welfare theorem, the optimality of the market outcome. This is an important thing to remember and recognize. And then, of course, we'll get into some detail today about how to do this in detail. So I'm going to give you 2 approaches that are kind of dominant in this field that deal with modeling price stickiness. And when I say prices, I mean prices of goods, but also possibly of wages. So you can use these models to think about rigid or sticky wages as well. Okay, but we're going to focus on the price setting of the firm. If you want to think about wages, you're going to have to think about wage setting by a union or by collective bargaining or by firms posting wages. Again, this is more detail, a more advanced course. So what you should remember, imperfect competition, incredibly important deviation from the competitive paradigm. And secondly, firms are setting prices with a view of maximizing something, maximizing profits, minimizing costs. Okay, so let's quickly review last time for the people who just came in. Last time we looked at the real business cycle first as an intellectual development. So it was a challenge. Prescott and Kitteland had this idea: can we derive a business cycle in the sense of Slutsky that actually has cycles that are irregular and they're driven by nothing other than technology, shifts to the production function? The answer is yes. And in doing so, we learned a lot about how to deal with these kind of dynamic models that are based on first principles, on microeconomic foundations. Okay, so we did that. We learned how to solve these models, recurring to things that we did when we discussed stochastic difference equations. So this is all part of the method that we use now as our bread and butter. But the real business cycle paradigm has weaknesses, and these weaknesses are evident and still important, and therefore we're going to move beyond it. One of the most important weaknesses I'll show you in a second was the fact that it just doesn't recognize the fact that money and credit are a leading indicator in the business cycle. So if we notice in the European Monetary Union that credit as an aggregate is not growing as fast as it did before, that's probably a good indication that the economy is slowing down. And it usually is about 4 to 6 quarters ahead of time. And matching that is the money supply, because the money supply is just the mirror image of credit in a banking system or a monetary system with banking. Okay, so notwithstanding, we have these wonderful methods we developed last time and the time before and the past 3 weeks, and these methods will accompany us into the end of the course. And this is kind of what we call dynamic stochastic general equilibrium modeling. That's what macro is all about these days, okay? So to give you a summary, most important thing if you want to understand how economists think, or if you want to write your own papers and make your own contribution to economics, is you need to write down a model that is somehow based on behavior that we can see in ourselves. So you want to state a model that's clear about people's preferences. They may not be rational, but at least they're well-defined and not arbitrary. Usually, to be not arbitrary, they have to be consistent. And that's why we'll stick to that. You have to write down a technology of production, because economies are about production of goods and services. You want to write down constraints that agents face, that the economy faces as a whole. You want to think about the market form, and that's going to be very important, okay, because we're going to talk about imperfect competition. No longer are firms price takers, they are price makers. Okay, when they do that, that changes the entire equation, because they're making the price in terms of the monetary unit. And then we need to discuss an equilibrium concept. All these things are robust, and in terms of requirements, whether we work with non-monetary real business cycle approaches or we work with the new Keynesian approach. Then you want to characterize agents' behavior using the first order necessary conditions. Then you want to characterize an equilibrium. We know what an equilibrium is from microeconomics. It's a situation where no agent has an incentive to change her behavior given what the other agents are doing. Then we want to look at the steady state of this model, and then we want to approximate the model around that steady state. And the technique we're going to use is a first order approximation, so it's linear. There are higher order approximations which are computationally challenging and difficult to solve, but now computers are getting better and better. We can actually do higher order approximations of models. The gains of these approximations are not always clear. So the log linearization is a good first cut. At your level of expertise, completely sufficient for understanding how macro works. We're going to use the methods we learned to solve the log linearized model as an approximation to the real thing. It's not the real thing, but it's close. Okay, and we can play with it. We can calibrate it. We can estimate, or we can calibrate the parameters of interest and use those to simulate the model. We can use that to create impulse responses in the sense of how does the economy play out in response to a single shock. And that is a classic means of communicating academic results. So if you read a modern paper in macroeconomics that we would produce or people would produce in other universities, they generally contain a graph that shows the response of the economy to an isolated shock and showing you how the economy processes that shock. Okay? So this is a very robust methodology that applies to macro models of all types. And there are other types of models that I haven't mentioned, we may discuss at the very last lecture. This is kind of the way we do business in macro. Okay? Now, just to remind you, the reason we moved to New Keynesian today is because there are weaknesses of the RBC model. First off, there's too little persistence. Okay? If you remember, the persistence of the model is the response to the shock after the shock has been taken away. What happens? Remember the RBC model said that a shift in the total factor productivity of the economy would reduce, would increase the incentives to invest, to defer consumption, because by doing so, one can take advantage of this increase in productivity. The agents have incentives to work harder, okay? And this shows up in the wage. And because labor is unpleasant, people will demand higher wages. So the model pushes you in a certain direction. But the propagation of that model is basically the capital stock. Because if I invest now, I'm going to have more capital tomorrow, and I'll have more capital in the next period after that, because capital doesn't completely depreciate. It actually lasts several periods. The other source of persistence is actually the productivity shock. I assumed that it has autocorrelation, which is, in a sense, I'm assuming the answer. So the biggest criticism from the other side of the RBC methodology was you're assuming what you want to show. You're not showing that the economy can do this on its own. So it's called deus ex machina, kind of assuming what you wanted to prove in the first place. So this is a damning criticism. So internal propagation, endogenous propagation is not very strong in this model. All other things I can talk about: consumption is too smooth compared to the data, investment's too volatile, employment is not volatile enough. We see big swings in unemployment and employment in the data for realistic assumptions about the way the individual households behave. So you need to put more bells and whistles on the model to get this to work. Okay, so this is considered a criticism, but it's possibly not first order. A lot of people say that's not a real criticism, you're just complaining. But when you talk about unemployment, it becomes a bit more serious. Unemployment in the RBC model is a voluntary phenomenon. People withholding labor from the market because the compensation they receive is not sufficient, or they feel sufficiently wealthy not to need to work. Okay? That doesn't sound like the way we think about unemployment. Either you need heterogeneity, or you need to have some frictions in the labor market that can generate this unemployment. So those are two things we talk about later. Of course, the biggest thing is that Prescott, actually in the reading I put online for you, if you're interested in reading it, Prescott actually says this: the business cycle is the best response of agents to stochastic economic productive possibilities that are evolving over time. So in a sense, we can't do better. Government intervention cannot cannot improve on welfare. It can only make things worse. Okay, so this is, you might say this sounds like a real conservative, rechtsliberale type of approach. In fact, I don't think the guys that derive this theory are necessarily of that genre, but the people who like this model tend to be of that genre. So, if you have a certain belief set, people that are attracted to this model because it basically says the government is only going to muck things up. Okay? That should not be the reason you select your model. You should select your model because it works. Okay, but I should warn you that at the same time, the New Keynesian model has a little bit of a bias towards people who like to spend government money to stimulate the economy because it predicts that it will work. Okay, so again, you have this issue, how objective can I be? What are my beliefs? Am I letting my beliefs influence my research program or not my results? We're all honest scholars, but it may influence the way we look for solutions to problems. Okay, so, to summarize, too little persistence, too volatile, unemployment's voluntary, and finally, no role for money. So the biggest weakness and the reason why the New Keynesian approach is still very vibrant, productive, and attractive place to do research is because it admits a role for money. It may not be a super big role, but it admits that the process of intermediation of credit and banking, but especially the way the money supply evolves over time, does have a role in the economy. And this was the picture I tried to motivate that with last time. This is a Burns-Mitchell picture centered around the peak of a reference cycle across 8 OECD countries, possibly 6 to 7 cycles per country. So this is quite a few cycles. This is the average behavior of an economy before and after with respect to the real money supply. So take M2 divided by the price level, take M1 divided by the price level. I believe this is M2. You can see that M2 stops growing about 4 to 6 quarters before the peak. Okay, and again, remember what the business cycle, a lot of other things are going on at the same time. You have lots of covariation, and we also know that credit is the mirror image of the M2 money supply on the bank balance sheet. So this is kind of suggesting that maybe credit is slowing down as well. So maybe the credit system of credit has something to do with it. Now, the RBC people have an answer to this, but I have to say, this is a pretty strong diagram. It's interesting to look at, and you can see there's a lot of persistence in this variable, which you don't have in the RBC model. Here's some other data that we can throw on the screen. Interest rates are pro-cyclical. Long-term interest rates with long periods to maturity are also pro-cyclical. Stock prices are a leading indicator. Okay, so this is another interesting leading indicator. Stock market tends to decline about a year before the recession kicks in. And the spread is also very strongly cyclical. So these are challenges for the RBC model, and that's why I take as a jumping point for today. Okay, so these are like the big challenges the RBC model has to deal with, and one of the papers I put on the Moodle site basically is about resuscitating the RBC model. So this was written in 1999 by 2 of the most prominent proponents of this setup, basically admitting that there's some challenges that need to be dealt with, and still the model does give us this set of tools that we can use in a modern sense to think about dynamics and avoid the Lucas critique to some extent, et cetera. Okay, so we're going to spend the rest of today and next week and the week after thinking about money. And again, remember David Hume? He's coming back. David Hume, I introduced him last year. He was the guy who told us about money being a wheel, the grease that sort of lubricates the wheels of commerce. It's not an objective per se. And he made this incredibly astute philosophical observation that although Spain was awash with gold after the colonies started bringing the gold, exporting the gold to Spain, it didn't really mean that Spain was better off per se because people had gold, but you can't eat the gold. To some extent you can wear it, but it's kind of heavy, and it's so the idea is it's kind of it's the grease, it's not the commerce itself. So that's the quote that I really want you to remember. This is really useful stuff. Okay, Hume was a contemporary of Adam Smith, and they talked about this kind of stuff because Scotland was having bank crises, and they were saying, is Scotland really worse off now that we have this bank crisis? Well, the capital's still there, okay, but maybe there's been some transfer from one person to another. And Hume just basically went on a limb and said, basically, in the long run, money should be neutral. Okay, but Hume was not, he wasn't obsessed with this. And this is a very short essay. I mean, it's like 6 pages. He basically says, okay, we can take the one side and think that money is just a normalizing factor. And in most of our macro courses, we divide by the price level. Okay, so this is basically a hat tip to Hume. Okay, so it's just a way of representing the stuff. If we live in Turkey, we use a different number than if we live in Venezuela, or we live in Zimbabwe, or we live in Germany. We're dividing by a different number of pieces of paper that we can use to buy a piece of bread. Okay, so you have to adjust for that. And most people who have common sense can see through that. Okay, so his marvelous idea was, we use Arabian numerical representation of numerical concepts. We could also use the Roman ones. They're a little bit more complicated, but in the end, it shouldn't make any difference at all in the real sort of course of events. But being as smart as he was, he didn't get obsessed on this. He actually said, however, if I look at Spain, and if I look at what happens when money comes into Spain, it's not neutral. So his observation was that in Cadiz, a big port city would bring the gold in, and the gold would get spent very quickly. Some people were willing to accept it, and these people were, having accepted it, were willing to spend it very quickly, because they all kind of figured, well, everyone thinks gold is kind of rare, but all this stuff came in, maybe I should try to unload some of it. Okay, it's like playing with Bitcoin or something. So they had this sort of, what's in the back of people's heads is actually what they're consuming and not necessarily what they're using as a means of payment. And he describes that in incredible detail, the way that there's a ripple through effect, sort of an internal propagation of this monetary shock, even though in the long run the price level of everything in Spain would basically reflect that over the long run. But as we get there, some people, who spent the gold quickly probably did better than people who were left holding the gold at the end. Okay, this is a really deep thought. Okay, and if you think about it, 250 years later, we haven't gotten that much farther. Okay, we're using different types of gold. We're using, credit cards, money balances at a bank, but in the end, the same ideas hold that we're holding for Hume back in the 18th century. Okay, so why does money matter? The logic is pretty much the same. And it wasn't just Hume. Later on, Jevons would pick up on this, other people as well. Nominal prices or nominal wages, i.e. in terms of the monetary unit, are somehow a state variable just like the capital stock. They're kind of sticky. Okay? For some reason, the price level just can't move like our consumption can. Okay? Now, think of it as a state variable opens up all sorts of vistas for thought and modeling. And yet, I think Hume still commands us to think of money as being neutral in the steady state. So we have to have that as like an anchor. The long run neutrality of money is a pretty good intellectual anchor. We don't have a situation where the government is constantly tempted to stimulate the economy, because we've seen many episodes in the past where the governments try to do that and they always lose out in the end. A great example of that is Argentina. Argentina, for the past 100 years, has had, so in every decade, except for one, the rate of inflation is increased. Okay, so the governments just haven't kind of learned their lesson yet, and they haven't been able to stimulate Argentina into being a rich country like it was in 1900. Okay, so this is kind of we can discuss this, but if you think money is non-neutral, it's probably non-neutral at a second order because of what Hume said. Okay, so a good model in this case has to have the following properties. It should be the case that monetary shocks have real effects in the short run, and in the long run, they should go away. And we should have something like an internal propagation. That means that the shock doesn't get dissipated in one period, but it's a little bit like Hume said, the money gets spent when the ships with the gold come in, and then the artisans take their money and spend it on their workers, and the workers take their money and spend it on food, and they go to the bars. And Cadiz is a hopping city for a while. There's a little bit of a boom, like in Berlin, and then eventually it kind of peters out. Okay, so let me try to motivate that by appealing to some data. Prices do appear to be sticky. Okay, so this used to be a big bone of contention. People still discuss this, but I think the evidence is overwhelming. Okay, it's really overwhelming, and thanks to the European Monetary Union, European countries got together and did a project actually looking at price rigidity across Europe. And I'll show you some data. It's quite fascinating. But also in the United States, there's a lot of evidence that shows that the average time between price changes by merchants is positive. It's not zero. Obviously, people are not changing prices all the time. It's not continuous, and it's quite a bit of time. Okay, so one of the leading studies in the United States is by Mark Bills and Clino, 2004. They found about, on average, 6 to 12 months. Okay, between average of 6 months between price changes. In the European, similar paper by Alan Blinder, there's a higher estimate of 12 months. It depends on which prices you're sampling. Obviously, it's very important. We'll see that. And in Europe, prices seem to be more rigid. Okay, so 13 months, and this is this famous study, which is a summary of many, many studies in the euro area. Now, why are they so different? Well, it's different because sectorally, prices are sticky to different degrees. I mean, most obviously, the price of gasoline at the gas station is quite flexible. I mean, I drive by the gas station, I see it's, $1.38 per liter, and then I come back, that evening it's $1.32. So prices are changing within the day. But that's just one example of millions of prices we face. And from this million are aggregated a price index that matters for inflation. Okay, so, the frequency changes across sector. You can imagine what would matter for this price change frequency. But just looking at the data in the United States, three months for goods and 8 months in services, you already get the idea. Services are non-storable, okay, so you can't do any sort of intertemporal substitution. And it also means there may be some contractual elements. So when I get my hair cut, I always use these appeals to your own experience, right? So you go to the friseur in Germany, okay, and sometimes you don't even know what the price is because they don't tell you, and they say, "Do you want to trim your eyebrows?" And then that means it's going to be €1 more expensive, okay? So you always have to be careful. You don't know what the final price is, but you could, you've been to the same hairdresser for a while. You understand what the price is. So when these prices change. Sometimes customers get a little bit irritated, like they get mad. I think you kind of ripped me off here. Why did you change your price? You didn't tell me. Okay, so there's kind of a contractual element. We'll see that that's an important motivation for price rigidity. But if you're in the market for raw materials, there is no relationship. You're on a free market. The prices are changing constantly. So the different types of goods that are traded have different frequencies of price adjustments. So this is a good example from the European study that I talked about already for the European Central Bank. They looked at two petrol stations, using the British terminology, one in Italy and one in France. You can see that these prices are changing all the time, but they're changing a little bit. Okay, so every day prices are changing. Now here's the same two countries' haircuts for men. Okay, so this is a serious study. They followed this guy, for upwards of, they surveyed this particular vendor of haircuts in these two countries, as in many different countries, as almost like a case study. Over 8 years, you see that we have a finite number of price changes. Sometimes over several years, nothing happens. Okay, so we have a heterogeneity of pricing behavior for this particular type of service. And that's an important service. Think of your rent of your apartment. How often is that price changed? Okay, so that's a fairly stable one in the realm of things. Okay, so there's quite a bit of heterogeneity, and that's going to be important for us later on. This is another interesting picture. This is a paper by Chevalier and co-authors where they look at the price of a type of cracker in a single store. Okay, now I don't know if you know what crackers are. Cracker, it's a Triscuit. Americans really like Triscuit crackers. Okay, what you see here is quite fascinating. This is Dominic's Finer Food Supermarket. It's a chain in Chicago. And basically you see that, and if you look carefully at this, you see that there is kind of a little bit of rigidity, but occasionally we have these big jumps. And these are what we call sales. These are like price events or price promotions. But the price is restored to its previous level. So you can think of this as a way of maybe eliminating excess Triscuits because they get old and they're not quite tasty anymore when they get stale. There's a lot of stuff going on at the micro level that we need to think about. Okay, so let me try to get into some detail on the different types of goods. So if you look at this table, and I urge you to stare at it when you go home and download these slides, I want you to think about what's going on here. So we have a bunch of countries, including the United States, including the European monetary area for 5 different types of goods or services, and then weighting using 2 different weighting schemes to get a total average frequency of price changes. So this is measured in a different way than before. This is the percentage of all goods in the survey in the period of survey that had at least one change in the survey month. Okay, so there's a bit of a truncation bias as well, but you can see that the middle category, energy, oil products, and the like, are very likely to have changed their prices within a month, whereas unprocessed foods, these crackers, for example, or sorry, that's a processed food. Unprocessed food would be like apples or tomatoes. Their prices are changed a little bit less frequently, and then processed food is even less frequently. And least frequently are services. Okay, so it's not just going to get your haircut, but also going to a restaurant and similar types of prices that you would get in a service mode. Okay, so if you add those up and use different weights, you can use the country weights or the euro area weights, you get actually remarkably similar numbers. So you could get the impression that maybe what's going on is that some countries have a very high share of unprocessed food that they're producing possibly at the wholesale level and selling, or maybe the role of energy is different across countries, or the role of services, which is very important. But we end up getting a similar degree of price rigidity across these euro area countries and the United States, although the United States seems to have a much more flexible price profile, price policy setting, which could have to do with competition. So you might think, okay, why do firms change prices? They change prices because we're competing, and if we have lots of competition, there's more pressure on us, given what others are doing, to adjust. If you're a monopolist at the limit, you can do whatever you want, and you change prices when you feel like it. Okay? When you add these prices together and you look at the aggregate perspective, you see that again, this is the most extreme version of this picture. This is just the CPI centered around the peak, and then averaged over several countries over cycles. You see that prices don't seem to change much in trajectory over the cycle. Now, if you do a Hodrick-Prescott detrending procedure, you get more of a drop when the recession comes. So prices seem to look a little bit pro-cyclical, but at the absolute level, I don't see it at all. Okay, so this would support the idea that the prices are kind of have a life of their own. They're sort of like state variables. Obviously, they don't have a life of their own, but they're very much dependent on the past. Okay, that's going to motivate our model going forward. Compare that with consumption, which is obviously much more cyclical. So again, it was just for comparison purposes. This is the raw price index over time and over these countries across the cycle. And here's consumption. So you see consumption really is pro-cyclical. Wages, no, not so much. Okay. Again, and this is Germany. Okay, so you can take a microscope. German wages are kind of they seem to have a lot of backward dependence, and we see that right now. We see a recovery in Germany that's lasted several years, and wages are only starting to rise over the past 2 or 3 years, and unemployment is really low now. Okay, so that, there's something in the data. Now, as I said, if you take the Hodrick-Prescott trend out, you get a bit more action. Okay, so this would indicate that around the Hodrick-Prescott trend, there is some evidence that prices are pro-cyclical, which makes me happy because that's kind of what we think on average is true in the data, but it doesn't have to be. If you remember our ASAD analysis, that was not necessarily the case. Okay, so I think I've convinced you that there's some evidence for price rigidity, and if you have price rigidity, then the monetary unit, its evolution, the evolution of money and credit, will affect the economy somehow. Has to. Okay, and why does it have to? We'll see in a second. So let's think about ways of modeling these sticky prices. So the common idea that goes back to Keynes is that people set prices. Okay, so the modern way of thinking about this is it's just we're ignoring reality, which is relevant reality, to think that prices are set by some Walrasian auctioneer. We can do that, but it may not generate predictions that are very highly correlated with what we observe in the data. Okay, so one of the big steps that I think even some of the hard-nosed people agree that it's good to think about firms having some autonomy and not just being price takers. And if that's the case, when the money supply or aggregate demand changes, this changes the parameters that drive their price setting decision. Okay? So how do you do that? Well, you could just assume that wages are set one period in advance or prices are set one period in advance. Back in the 1970s, this was very popular. It's kind of ad hoc. You're just assuming. You write down the price and then you go to the market. We see that doesn't always capture what's going on because people change prices sometimes overnight, and we need to understand why they do that. So these are two early efforts. This is for people who are interested in the literature. This is an old idea that goes back to Keynes, but in terms of writing down formal models, this is the 1970s is where it really starts going, starts the ball rolling, and many of you have heard of John Taylor already in this lecture and other lectures. John Taylor was the inventor of the Taylor rule, but he also, when he was even younger, was thinking about how contracts could explain price rigidity. So you could imagine a third of the economy sets prices every period, and they set the same price for the next 3 periods. Okay, that's kind of a fancy example of what he actually did. He did it with 2, but with 3 it kind of makes, okay, it sounds like the United States. So you have an economy, and then you have every period, 1/3 of the price setters get to reset their prices, and they set that price at a constant level for the next 3 periods. So you're hardwiring a rigidity in the price level from the very beginning. So this was considered innovative at the time because formally it's hard to write down that model and to solve it. But we've moved beyond that. Okay, so one of the first things we'll talk about today is the Rothenberg approach. So Julio Rothenberg, who was an MIT professor, who went to Harvard, and he passed away last year, 2 years ago, had the idea that people don't like to see changing prices. If there's a cost to a vendor of changing prices too frequently, it aggravates the consumer because the consumer has to remember, what did I pay last time? It's like what I said before. You go to the barber or the hairdresser and she tries to change the price. You kind of get upset about that. So if you do that quite aggressively, it can lead to higher costs of doing business. Okay, so Rothenberg wrote this paper in 1982, and it's still kind of a classic, and we're going to use it to think about this. And the alternative is popular with Jordi Galí and his students, is the so-called Calvo approach, which basically says that every vendor, every seller, has the option of changing prices only randomly. So it's not you can't change your price anytime you want. You have to somehow have the window of opportunity. Okay? Now, some people make fun of this. I'll tell you about some stories later. But the idea is your ability or your option of changing your price only occurs randomly. Think of a Poisson process. Okay, so the probability between being able to do this is distributed exponentially, which means basically, if I get a chance to change my prices, I should probably take it very seriously because maybe it won't happen for a while. Okay, so those two are the paradigms that drive nominal rigidities, both on the price setting side as well as on the wage setting side in modern macro models. And if you're really into this, there's some new innovations that have come along that actually, first off, thinking about wages in this context. So if you read the Benassi book, there's a little bit of text on that, and also a paper by Ersig and his colleagues at the Fed look at nominal wage contracts. So a lot of what we debate about in macro is whether the wages or the prices are more rigid or less rigid. In fact, most modern models have both. Okay, so this kind of hard bakes this sensitivity to aggregate demand in the model. Okay? And the most modern innovation is the idea that it's not the rigidity of the price that matters, it's the rigidity of the ability to reset your prices. So it's the ability to recalculate your prices. Okay, so this is a very fine distinction that I'll bring up in the last lecture of the course. Okay, so now I'd like to give you some microeconomics. Okay, so now you're kind of saying, well, all these ideas, just look at the red stuff if you want to remember what's important for this course, but these are the foundations of sticky prices. Okay, so price level is sticky because individual prices are set and they're not changed when the opportunity might arise, and the question is why. So I'm going to try to explain why we think microeconomics can help us. Okay, so you can think of time-dependent pricing, or you can think of state-dependent pricing. So state-dependent pricing is kind of what we're going to be interested in. That is, there's a state of the world when it makes sense for you to change your price. Okay, and again, I've already said this. I'm going to show you some diagrams now to reinforce this notion of the microeconomics of why firms would want to change their prices or how they set them in general. This is a central aspect of the new Keynesian approach. I already said this a jillion times, but it's really important to remember. Imperfect competition and the ability of firms to take advantage of that. Okay? And again, this is basic economic logic. Everything we do in life, in economic life, is a comparison of the gains and the costs of doing it. Okay, so I'm going to appeal to this famous, it goes back to Joan Robinson, but Joan Robinson, the great female economist, never used it for macro, but she used it to think about what firms do, and 50 years later, a couple of Americans pick it up and use it to explain how the price level evolves. So this is, again, men taking advantage of women's progress. I can't believe this is going to be on the internet, but I'm going to say it anyway. It's kind of like Rodin and okay, you get it. Okay, so here's the picture that Joan Robinson gave us and that Greg Mankiw exploited creatively to think about this. So this is what every undergraduate learns in the first semester of microeconomics. Okay, a firm faces a downward sloping demand curve D, and it has costs that are summarized by two curves. One is the average cost curve, and the other is the marginal cost curve. Both contain a little bit different information, and the average cost curve I've suppressed to make you think about the marginal cost. So what is the cost of producing an extra unit? And the MR curve is the downward sloping curve that is derived from the marginal increment to my revenue of producing an additional unit. Okay, because I have influence on my price, if I produce an extra unit, I actually depress the price of all the units I've sold before that I can get rid of in a point in time. So if I want to charge a lower price, I can sell more, but I'm going to be only able to get a lower price just by the nature of the demand curve. Okay, so if you believe in the demand curve, then you have to believe in the marginal revenue curve, which has a steeper absolute slope than the demand curve. And if it's linear, it's going to be twice the slope, okay, in absolute value terms. So the optimal behavior of a monopolistic competitor, we're going to call this a monopolist, but it's also a monopolistic competitor because there are other companies that it's competing with, is going to set, to maximize profits, it's going to set production such that marginal costs are equal to marginal revenue. It's not a price taker now. If it's a price taker, it would produce price equals marginal cost. That would be a characterization of optimal behavior. But here, I can make my profits as big as possible by setting the incremental cost to production equal to the incremental revenue I get from the extra production, cognizant of the fact that too much output depresses my total price that I can get for all the other units that I'm selling, okay? So to find out what profits are, I need to know the average costs. So now I'm going to draw the average cost curve, which is this, again, it looks like a bow bent to the horizontal axis, and that's giving the average cost of production, which incorporates this assumption that there's some fixed costs And that because marginal costs are rising, average costs have to be rising at some point also. And it starts rising at the point where marginal and average costs are equal. Okay? So, if you don't remember this stuff, please watch the movie and look at this picture a lot. Okay? Because this is really what modern macro is about. Because the question is, what happens when demand changes? Okay? And firms are setting, remember, firm sets the price in euros, not in pieces of bread or pieces of gold. I mean, it's using the monetary unit, which is costlessly produced by the central bank or by the banking system. Okay, so the question is, what happens when demand shifts like this? And I'm giving you a linear shift in demand. So everyone should take a look at this. Don't look at your phones right now. Look at me. Look at this picture. Okay, so the blue is the shifted demand curve and the shifted marginal revenue curve. By assumption, the marginal cost curve has not shifted. Okay, it might have shifted in a completely neutral situation. Maybe the costs are also rising, but I'm just going to give you an example of demand shifting for some reason, holding costs constant. So you see the firm is faced with an interesting decision. What should the firm do? Okay, suppose you were running this bar over here, which has been here ever since I've been here. Okay, now they're selling food, but it used to be just a place where you go have a beer. They see a surge in demand. What should they do? How does a firm react to a demand shift? Okay, there are many different answers to that question, but there are two extreme answers. Okay, one is just not to do anything. Okay, so that's the one extreme. I keep my prices exactly where they were, and I'm going to produce Q prime. I'm just going to expand my production. Now, does that make sense? Yes, because price exceeds marginal cost at every additional unit. So that is a money-making opportunity. I'm going to make money by doing that. Okay? Constant price and produce more quantity at the old price. That's the rigid nominal price solution, if you like. I don't do anything. Okay, so, and in fact, you could imagine that curve shifting even more to the right, and at some point, it might actually become uncomfortable for the firm, because at that point, marginal costs might exceed the old rigid price. Then the firm would probably say, I don't want to do any more. I think I've had enough. Okay, but the integral under P bar above MC is profit at the margin. Okay? So that's kind of the sticky price option for the firm. The firm could also do the Joan Robinson thing. Okay? The firm could actually maximize its profits by changing its price. And if it's going to do it, it might as well do it full-blown maximizing mode. Go all the way. And what does it do? It takes the new marginal revenue curve, sets it equal to marginal costs, takes that intersection and charges the implied price reading off the demand curve, which would be P star prime. So that's a price increase. Okay, so the firm, we've drawn this in very stark terms. Do nothing, you make money, demand is good. I mean, every firm here loves it when the tourists come. They have a bigger volume at old prices, that's fine. But they could actually maybe milk the market a little bit more, make some more money by raising the prices. Okay, so we have option one, do nothing. Option two, raise prices. Okay, this option actually maximizes profits, but it might have other disadvantages. People may get aggravated if the price goes up. Okay, so that's the Rothenberg idea. Okay, or it may just not be possible. Maybe they have a contract. Okay, maybe they've got this implicit agreement, or maybe they're just too busy. They can't change their prices every day. They have to say, okay, we're going to change our prices every Thursday or every first Monday in the month. Okay, so if you have, that would be the Calvo idea. So those two ideas are ways of putting some friction, some sand in the greasy wheels of commerce and causing the prices to move a little bit less than completely. So now I'm going to ask you, how can I figure out why would a firm, if the firm's making money by just keeping the prices the same, why should it raise its prices ever? So I'll let you answer that question. What do you think? Remember, economics is always about on the one hand and on the other hand. So I'm making money. Look, if I do the rigid price thing, look, I'm making money here, right? I'm making a lot of profit here, but if I'm greedy, I can get even more. Okay, and maybe there's some reason for being greedy. Yeah.
Costs are not staying constant.
Well, costs could change. Okay, that would prompt me to maybe recalculate. So that would mean maybe the marginal cost curve also shifts. Okay, so maybe wages start to rise. So that's a second order effect that we're going to talk about later. But even in the context of this, okay, there's kind of an opportunity cost of not going optimal. Okay, so let's see if we can find that. This red triangle, it's kind of a pseudo triangle, is the profits that I'm foregoing by just sitting on my can and not doing what I should be doing. So suppose I have a shareholder. I'm a manager of the bar, and the guy says, "Hey, you know, this place is packed. Why don't you raise the prices, man? I got my money invested here. You'll make some money for me." That's the way it works in life. Okay, even if I'm a nice guy, I love you guys, you're my customers, but my boss, my owner is saying, "You're not making enough money for me." Okay, so this red bit is basically the lost profits of not raising prices to the optimal level. Now, how do I see that? It's the difference between marginal costs and marginal revenue. Because if I produce more than my P star, Q star, I'm actually losing money relative to what I could be doing. Okay, I'm still making money, so I'm happy. Maybe I get a bonus based on my profits, but my manager wants maximum profits. So he's going to push me to eventually start charging P star. Okay, and I'm going to come back, I'm going to push back and say, hey, if I raise these prices, we're going to drive these guys away. There's a bar right next door. Or they're going to go to Prenzlauer Berg, and they're just or no one goes to Prenzlauer Berg. Neukölln, maybe? No one goes to Moabit. Okay, so you go to Moabit, you can hang out there. There are places there, you know. So you have to have this Abwägung, right? You're balancing costs and benefits, and that's what it's all about. Okay, so I'm going to use the Rothenberg approach first to motivate this. And this is how I'm going to get my first cut at the new Keynesian Phillips curve. I'm going to have a Phillips curve that recognizes the cost of changing prices in nominal terms because I aggravate my consumers, my customers. And I also have a cost of being away from where I want to be because my boss, my manager is saying, hey, make some money for me. Where's the cash, right? I mean, it's nice that you have some profits here, but I want to see the real profit. Okay? So again, I have to entertain you because this is probably completely boring to most of you, but it's really important, okay? So I'm about to do some math now to capture those ideas. Okay, so Rothenberg, Calvo, two leading approaches of capturing this rigidity, this friction. Okay, and again, Rothenberg is basically increasing costs of changing my prices positive or negative, so confusing my customers. Rothenberg is completely asymmetric and agnostic about whether one is worse than the other. And Calvo's idea is just basically, I can't change my prices all the time because I'm busy doing other stuff, and if I do, I'm gonna change. But think of a fairy, like a fae, right? There's people who don't like these models talk about the Calvo fairy, and the Calvo fairy is like this. It's like in Peter Pan, this little spirit that comes by and taps you on the head with a wand, and then at that point you can change your price. So the Calvo fairy has to visit you before you can change the price. Now, a lot of people use that to make fun of this model, but it doesn't really change the logic, which is there's a friction. So you might think it's because of a fairy, you might think it's because of some random mood or something. It doesn't really matter. What matters is you have this rigidity that we obviously observe in the data, that firms don't change their prices every day. So let's start with Rothenberg. Let's get rolling with Julio. It's really sad. Julio died of cancer. It was very sad. I knew him when I was a graduate student. Super nice guy. There are very few economists who are really nice guys. Julio was a really nice guy. And he actually cited a paper that I wrote when I was a grad student. That's why I really liked him. If you don't believe me, I can show it to you. Okay, so his idea was that firms have continuous control. There is no fairy in this model, but firms understand that if they change their prices too fast or too much in any period in time, they get penalized. They have to pay a cost, and that's going to reduce their profits. Okay? I'm going to follow Robert's exposition. I put this online. This is a nice paper. There's some stuff that you may not care about or understand, but it's one of the cleanest presentations of this model, just to get the idea on the table, and we can talk about fine-tuning later. So the idea behind Roberts is that firms are minimizing their costs. They're not maximizing profits like before, but we can easily move back to that mode in a second. But right now, just to make it really simple and beautiful, we're going to take the firm choosing its price. It only produces one good, and it chooses every period its price, given what it would really like to do, P star, and given what the other guys are doing, which is P prime. Okay, so this is a constrained optimum in the sense that a firm faces an environment of competitors, and the firm gets shocked occasionally to its demand. So this is a log linear model. Everything we've done before makes perfect sense. It's going to be a linear equation. I'm going to write it down in a second. We're going to derive that equation, and then we're going to use that equation to think about the Phillips curve. Now, next week, I'll show you how you can actually write down a utility maximization problem that can give you the demand curve that we're going to use. I can also show you how to use a profit maximization problem to motivate the model that we're playing with now. This is kind of a baby version to help you think about this very complicated setup. So the firm chooses P, given the other guys, P prime, and given its desire to maximize profits, which we're going to call P star. That's where it really wants to go. And in the equilibrium, everyone's behaving the same way, so P and P prime are basically synonymous. Okay, so we're going to use this trick. A lot of macroeconomists use this trick, which is that each individual takes the rest of the world as given, but in the end, we're all the same, so we end up doing the same thing. It's a really brilliant. Blanchard was one of the propagators of this mechanism, which is really smart. Okay, so here's Julio, and this is log linear. So think of everything in terms of log linear elasticities. And the cool thing about it is if the firm is setting the log of price, then the change of that log in price is one step away from the inflation rate. Okay, remember that. Small changes of the log is like a percentage change. So if we're talking from period to period, we're talking about the seed of the inflation rate. Okay, so it's again, this is for students, for graduate students to think about. You can make this as fancy as you want, but in the end, what matters is whether you can get the knowledge from the model. The model delivers a certain amount of logic. I'm going to spend some time thinking about this because this is one of two very important ways of thinking about this problem. Okay, so think about P star. In our picture before, P star was where the firm would like to be if nobody was bothering it about anything. So if the firm got the contract, maximize profits, the firm would go right to P star, set marginal revenue equals marginal cost, make a lot of profits, no better number for his or her manager, and that would be it. Now, the optimal price in a general model would be a function of the position of the demand curve, it would be a function of the costs, it would be a function of a lot of things. So what Rothenberg and what Roberts did is they reduced this to a simple equation. P star is basically a function of three things. What are the other guys doing? Because if the other guys raise their prices, the other guys' customers are going to come to me, that's going to raise my demand. Okay, that's easy. It's also going to depend on epsilon, which is the position of the curve. So when epsilon is positive, my curve is shifting out. No matter what my competitors are doing, no matter what I'm doing, the curve is shifting out. It also depends on Y, which is aggregate demand. Okay, so this is where we get to the Phillips curve. This is going to help us get to the Phillips curve. So this is like the level of demand in the economy. And since we're in log linear terms, think of Y as being the log of output relative to its trend. So it's like the output gap. So little y, positive means the economy is above trend, and y negative means the economy is below trend because we're in log linear terms. Think of it as percent. So the model is ingenious, right? Beta is the elasticity of optimal price with respect to the output gap. So we all think when Germany is booming, firms want to raise their prices. You know, they don't say it, but like Volkswagen would love to raise their prices right now. All other things given, okay? And if Peugeot raises its prices, Volkswagen will certainly want to raise their prices. But if Peugeot is cutting their prices, maybe Volkswagen will reduce their P-star. That's where they want to be, but they can't be there all the time because they have other problems. They have to deal with their own past. And that's what Rothenberg stresses. Okay, so again, this is the definition of this is what the other guys are doing. And again, this is a stand-in for all the millions of people in Germany that are setting prices every day, and they're facing competition, they're facing aggregate demand, and they're facing shocks. And these shocks can be any sort of demand shock. Okay, so P prime is what the other guys are doing. Take it as given. I can't influence them. Think of Y as the exogenous level of aggregate demand, and think of beta as an elasticity, because we're in a log-log world. Again, the beauty of logarithms in economics is we suddenly get to the elasticity concept, which is beautiful in itself. And think of epsilon as a supply shock, cost shock, or a shock to energy prices, and it's equal to 0 for, you know, normal times. Okay? So now let's get to the model. The problem that Rothenberg identified is that price adjustment is costly. I aggravate my consumers. I aggravate my customers. They go away. I have to negotiate with them. I have to deal with them. They start throwing things at me. They complain. And we're going to write this as a real cost term. So it's going to be convex in the change. Convex means that the marginal effect is increasing as the change gets bigger. It's not linear, it's convex. And I'm going to make it quadratic. That's a cheap convex form, okay? And again, this is also incredibly smart because it's approximation. Think of it as a second order approximation to a cost function. And C is positive. So again, I'm going to be paying a price for being away from my P star, but I'm also going to be paying a price for trying to get there too quickly, because then I'm going to aggravate my clientele. Okay. So Rothenberg wrote many papers on this, and he was eventually at Harvard Business School talking to businessmen and trying to validate his theory. And we do know this is a fact. People have finite capacity to remember what people have paid in the past. And I see this every time I go to a bar. I forget, what did I pay last time? Isn't it more expensive now? I mean, so people have limited memory, and I think firms have an incentive to try to at least stabilize things at some level, because they just don't want to, people might not like the product and they don't buy it anyway, but if they don't buy it because you're changing your prices all the time, it's a bit of a problem. Okay? This implies that small steps are better than big ones. So if a firm sees its cost going up, it's going to have to recover its cost at some point. It's going to have to move to its P star, but it's going to take small steps. It's going to kind of smooth things out. And we see that a lot as well. There's a big debate, actually, whether big steps are more important than small ones. We haven't had much inflation in the Western world in the past 30 years, so we've forgotten what inflation's like. Okay, so hopefully we won't have to deal with it again, but there's obviously a trade-off between adjusting and not adjusting, and that's exactly what Rothenberg is trying to get at in this model. Okay, so now it gets complicated because I'm going to write down the problem for the firm. The firm is going to choose an optimal policy, not just a single price in our baby diagram. It's going to choose a sequence of prices. It's going to choose a price policy at T0 going forward. Just like a consumer in Ramsey or in the recent RBC setup, you choose a sequence. Okay, and of course, when you get to the next period, there'll be some shock, and you'll change your policy. But it's not a policy that you will regret absent shocks. So that's a really important idea. It's a time-consistent policy. Okay, so the firm is going to set this price path. It's going to write it down. So think about a manager, a product manager for Gillette. Okay, I have a friend who used to work for Gillette, so this is kind of what they do, right? They write down, okay, so in the winter men don't shave, but in the summer they shave a lot, so we got to, maybe we can adjust the price a little bit, but let's write down this price path. So every month they would write down a different price, and it would go into the future, maybe a few years into the future. But of course, no one takes it seriously. After a few years, we'll learn a lot more about the market. Maybe the market collapses, maybe it'll explode. But we want to set this hypothetical path to maximize the present discounted value of profits, not just profits today, but the present discounted value. So we know from consumption already that this intertemporal dependency is key. And that's why we have the Euler equation, because you care about how you consume over time. You care about the path of consumption over time. It's exactly the same idea with Rothenberg. The price policy of the firm will also be intertemporally optimal, because the firm knows that if it takes a big step today, okay, it's going to be very costly, it's going to lose a lot of customers, but it means tomorrow it won't have to make a big step, okay? So there's a cost and a benefit for doing this adjustment, and choosing the right path is the one that minimizes the costs of this policy. Now, in a more advanced course, maybe later on I'll show you the slide that shows how you can transform this into a profit maximization problem. So if you take Lutz Weinke's advanced course, they do the full Monty. Okay, so it's Gali squared with profit maximizing firm, stochastic production. It's the same idea, okay? Except in Lutz's course, they'll stress the Calvo option, which comes up in about 10 minutes, okay? But let's finish Rothenberg first. And again, I've been doing this for a long time. I like to do this for simplicity. I think you get the idea of price rigidity and frictions out there on the table, and then you can think about it and chew on it, and then you can spit it out and go for something better. Okay? Okay, so here's the formal problem. Choose the sequence of PT from t equals 0 to infinity to minimize the discounted expected costs at t equals 0. And it looks like this. It looks a little bit like utility maximization, but here it's cost minimization. So I'm choosing P0, P1, P2, P3, again setting t equals 0, conditional on information that's available today. So I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. I know what's happening right now. I have all this information. And I'm taking the sum from t equals 0 to infinity of a discounted value using a deterministic discount factor r. So r is like 1 plus little r, like we had before, raised to the tth power, okay, but now it's going to be the inverse. So it's 1 over 1 plus r, or little r, or you can also put a negative sign here next to t if you want, if that makes you more comfortable. Okay, so I'm discounting these future costs, and the costs have two components. One is how far am I away from my optimum? So that's that red bar, that red triangle in the diagram before. And this is the step I'm planning to take today, given what I did yesterday. Yesterday is kind of the anchor. If I charged 3 euros for a beer last period, it's a low price. So if I go to 4, I'll be getting closer to my optimum, but I'm going to pay. A lot of customers are going to get mad at me. That's a big change. That's a huge change. Okay? And because these are logs, that's a percentage change. So going from 3 to 4 euros a beer is a 33% increase. And I see you guys are asking, why does he always talk about beer? There's a reason for that. Okay? So, to quote one of my Supreme Court justices. Okay? Now, after you substitute for P star, we know what P star is because we have the equation for P star. So we can plug it in. P star is given to the firm by its environment. So we get this. We basically see, that's a choice variable of the firm, and this is a choice variable of the firm. So when you write down the first order necessary conditions, you'll see that the firm is always doing this trade-off between getting to where I have to go, but not going too fast. Because if I go too fast, I pay a price. Okay, so this is an unconstrained maximization problem because I've substituted the relevant constraint, which was the optimal price. I just plugged it in. So it's an unconstrained, and it's a quadratic problem, so it's really easy to solve. Everybody as a master who claims to be a master in economics should be able to do this, because you know how to do calculus, and taking derivative of quadratic is baby stuff. Okay, so there it is. Okay, the only trick you have to remember is that the differentiation operator, just like with the RBC model, is a linear operator, and you pass it through the expectations operator. So because they're both linear operators, you can actually take the derivative inside the expectations and then set that baby equal to 0. That's legit. Okay? Okay? And the first order necessary conditions will exactly have the interpretation, which you should memorize, that the cost of a marginal cost of changing my price a little bit to get closer to P star is offset exactly by the costs I pay by moving too fast. The quadratic term in the derivative is neutralized by the cost of being far away. Okay, so this is the first order condition. Please stare at this for a few seconds. Okay, so basically this says that in expectation, for all periods t equals 0, 1, 2, 3 into the future, this condition has to hold if I'm doing the right thing. Okay, every firm has a positive C, so there's a positive cost of moving rapidly away from where I was last period. Okay, so that's this part. Now, if I change my price, I reduce my cost because I'm getting closer to where I want to be, so that's good. I'm reducing the size of the red triangle. Okay, and here's the cool part. It's dynamic because if I take a big step today, I have to take a smaller step tomorrow, ceteris paribus. Okay, I mean, if I'm only changing PT, then holding PT plus 1 constant, I'm closer to PT plus 1. Okay, so that's that's the intertemporal part, and that's going to give me the inflation rate in the end. That's basically where it's all going to come from. Okay, so this variational argument says that if a firm's doing, if its marketing department is doing the right thing on the price, then it's basically going to make this thing as small as possible, the cost as small as possible by fulfilling this first order condition, not just in period 0, but in t equals 1, 2, 3 in expectation. Because this is all linear, expectation of a linear thing is going to be the sum of the expectations. Wow, that's so cool. The only thing that's not known is PT plus 1. I don't know what I'm going to do tomorrow because I don't know what the shock is tomorrow, but I sure like hell know what I'm going to do today. Okay? So, it's an Euler equation. It's an intertemporal or a Euler equation if you're American. It's the optimal behavior which balances costs and benefits, incorporating the fact that future benefits may be realized by changing price today. Okay, so now we have to just move to an equilibrium concept. Everyone is doing the same thing. Everyone is charging prices according to this Euler equation, this Euler equation, okay? So if everyone's doing it, then P and P prime have to be equal. Okay, so that means we can actually simplify the heck out of this thing. In a symmetric equilibrium, PT equals P prime T for all T. Even if I'm not there yet, I know this is the equilibrium condition in the future. Okay, so inflation is simply the change in P prime. Okay, and that means I can actually solve this thing, and Andreas will do it again in more detail. It's just as simple, just put the left-hand side PT and then subtract PT minus 1, and then you get the inflation rate today is equal to the expectation of the inflation rate tomorrow, plus a term that depends on how your economy is doing relative to its trend, whether you have an output gap that's positive or negative, and whether you've had a shock. And you can see that there's a normalizing factor or sort of an adjustment factor here, which is C. The more costly it is to change, the less an output gap will influence the inflation rate because people are still kind of going it real slow. It's going to take a long time for that output gap to show up in the inflation. So that'd be a flat Phillips curve. Similarly, if you have a very high cost of changing prices, a supply shock, a cost shock, will have a very small impact effect on the inflation rate today. Okay, so we'll come next week. We'll stare at these in detail. Think of this as a measure of real rigidity, and this is a measure of nominal rigidity. Just write that down in your notes. We'll come back to it in a second. Okay? So you can see it's kind of both of these things matter for the slope of the Phillips curve. It's not just one thing. It's not just C, it's also beta. So how much does tension in the goods market actually translate into inflation because firms have a need to change their price, their P star, looking forward. Okay? So in the last 10 minutes, I'm going to give you the broad brushstrokes of the alternative approach. So Rothenberg, don't aggravate your customers, but you want to get to where you want to go. You want to maximize profits for your boss, your manager, because she's giving you a hard time. You have a trade-off. It's easy to understand. Okay? The alternative approach, Guillermo Calvo, 1983. These are incredibly robust papers. This guy should get a Nobel Prize, probably. Maybe you'll get it with Mike Woodford, Jordi Gali, Olivier Blanchard. Okay, so I'm just speculating. So it's going to be on tape. So if I get it right, you guys can take me out for a beer. I'm going to use the same Roberts paper to derive this baby comparison because Roberts is talking about cost minimization. The correct way to do it nowadays is profit maximization, and there's some interesting cases when those aren't equivalent. Okay, but I just want you to get the flavor and the final form of the Phillips curve in the case of Calvo. So Calvo, firms cannot change prices whenever they want. In the Rothenberg model, firms can change prices whenever they want, but they don't want to because it's bad for business. In the Calvo model, they can only do it when the fairy comes and touches them with a magic wand. Okay? And we're going to use some math to spice this up a little bit. This is where it gets interesting, okay? Because this probability of being able to change prices is an incredibly important parameter of the model. And again, if you remember my data from the beginning, this would kind of imply that if you're in the gas station business, your Calvo parameter is different from if you're a barber or a hairdresser, okay? For whatever reasons. So we're going to say that in the discrete time model, you can change your price with probability 1 minus phi. Phi lies between 0 and 1. Okay? So think of phi as the probability that you get stuck for that period. You can't, somebody calls you on the phone, I can't change my price because I'm busy dealing with somebody. Okay? So it's a probability of somehow getting disturbed. And during that period, your price just continues at its old level. Okay, so the probability you can't change your price is phi. Or as the Germans say, phi. Okay? Phi is a measure of nominal price rigidity. Just like C was a measure of nominal price rigidity in the Rothenberg model. Okay? And again, this is ad hoc to some extent. We assume a value of phi. Phi low means prices are not very rigid. Phi close to 1 means prices are really rigid. Okay? And firms are allowed to change prices when the fairy comes, and then they're going to say, okay, I know I can't change my price for some time after this, so I better do it right. Okay? And this means that firms are going to front load their price policies. So write that down, front loading. It means, some people say this is not a terribly realistic aspect of the model. It means that basically, if my customer leaves me alone, I hang up the phone and I'm going to reset my prices. I'm going to really go for it because I may get called again, disturbed. I like the call thing because the fairy doesn't make sense to me. But getting called on the phone is a problem. If someone calls you, you cannot conduct business, right? You're stuck. You have to hire somebody. Maybe they can do it, but you can't do it yourself. Okay, so I'm going to give you a little important result for Calvo, which is absolutely useful for your life. It's true whether you stay in this business, whether you do business, whether you do, numerical programming. It's really a cool result. This type of probability distribution, okay, the probability of observing n periods between price changes is an exponential Poisson type of distribution. Okay, in discrete time, it's easier than in continuous time, but we've we can do continuous time. We did it already, but we're not going to do it. But we could, because I know you're smart. Okay? But I'm going to do this easy way just because it's so easy to think about. If a firm has to wait one period, okay, then we know from the Calvo parameter that 1 minus phi is the probability it will get to change its price immediately after. Okay? But maybe it has to wait. If it has to wait, that happens with probability phi. Okay, so if you need to wait exactly n periods, then you will have waited n periods, and then you get a chance. So the probability distribution is the density function is going to be given by 1 minus phi times phi to the nth power. You have to wait one period always. Okay, so this is a key formula, right? Now, is this a probability distribution? What do I need to know? Now I get to ask you a question. Maybe I can ask the person who just came in. How do I know this is a probability distribution? Do I know? What defines, come on, you all took statistics, I know. What makes this a density? They have to sum up to 1 over all the states of the world. That's what you said. That's what you meant to say. They have to be positive, okay, and they also have to add up to 1. Okay, so we can check that. Let's just write it down. Looks kind of nasty, but it's just a geometric series, right? Factor out 1 minus phi, take the rest, use the formula for a geometric sum, and it turns out to be exactly right. Okay, so it is a probability density. That's great. So we can use that to calculate the expected time between price changes. Okay, so how do I do that? If it takes 1 minus phi probability to get exactly 1 period of waiting time, then what is the probability that I wait exactly 2 periods? It must be 1 minus phi times phi. And if I want an expected value, I have to take 1 and multiply it by the first probability, and I have to take 2 and multiply it by the second probability, and take 3 and multiply it by the probability of waiting exactly 3 periods. Okay, so we can write that down. It's this expression. 1 times the probability of waiting exactly 1 period, 2 times the probability of waiting exactly, not more than, just exactly 2 periods, and then writing this out. So then we can do the same manipulation we did before, but then we reach this point we had this object, which looks kind of nasty. It turns out that you can use a trick in calculus to simplify that. Okay, it turns out that thing is the derivative with respect to phi of this object. Okay, now why? Because it's calculus. And it's a trick that I learned when I was in graduate school, and now you're going to learn it. Okay? So because once you do that, look what happens. Remember, differentiation is a linear operator, so I can factor that out. And then I can rewrite what's inside. And it turns out that simplifies to exactly 1 over 1 minus phi. So that's the lesson of the Calvo model. The expected time between price changes is 1 over 1 minus phi. Okay? So if phi is almost 0, then I basically wait 1 period on average. It'd be a very rare event for me to wait more than 1 period. But if phi is very high, then I may have to wait a long time. So phi is 0.75, then 1 over 1 minus 0.75 is 1 over 1/4 equals 4. So the average time between price changes is 4 periods. Average, not exactly always 4 periods, because it's an exponential distribution, or it's a Poisson distribution over waiting times. So that's an important idea. You might observe a firm that actually changes prices like next period, but that doesn't mean it's the average. The average firm has to wait much longer. So we have a distribution of price changes. So that's a key part of the Calvo model. The Calvo model is going to give us a distribution of prices that actually is easy to manipulate. It gives us an expected value. It's going to give us an inflation rate that's implied. I'll do that next time. So it is the competing version, competing alternative to Rothenberg's model, which I presented earlier. So we have two competitors, and both have pros and cons. The Calvo model has the advantage that it generates a price distribution. We will always observe some prices that are stuck. Even after many periods, some prices will still kind of be stuck. The probability of waiting infinite time is 0, but there are some firms that will be stuck for a long time. A lot of people consider that a weakness of the model. Okay? But it does give you a distribution. Okay? We do observe firms that have really bad prices. Sometimes it's your rent. Your rent is a bad price for your landlord because prices in Berlin, rents are going up, and you're saying, I'm paying 300 euros, whoa, yeah? But that's a misprice, that's a price misallocation if you think about it. The P star for your rent is probably higher right now. When I first came to Berlin, it was lower because rents were going down. Okay, so think of it that way. That's a nice way of thinking about it. On the other hand, Calvo is completely mechanized. It's completely rigid. We're assuming this ferry going around, or the telephone call, which distracts you from proper price setting, that's a deus ex machina too, in my view. So I'm not a big fan of Calvo, but a lot of people in my field are, so I have to accept it. Okay? But these are the two leading contenders. So next time we see each other, I'm going to go into detail on Calvo and show you how Calvo gives us exactly the same Phillips curve with a few minor details, difference to that which we derived with the Rothenberg model. So once you understand that, you understand the basis for the neoclassical, the new Keynesian reformulation of the Phillips curve, which has all the things we want to have. It's more robust to the Lucas critique. It's based on first principles, and it's a good way to go forward. Okay, thanks for coming. I'll see you next week.